So it's not all what it's cracked up to be when you buy a Ferrari. And the reason we say that is because we have a lot of clients that will instruct the dealer not to touch the car, not to wash the car when it comes into the dealership. And that makes the dealership kind of nervous because they want control of their customer. And now it's got to be brought to us because the customer knows that for all Ferraris or most Ferraris are nothing close to perfect. And us being in the business for over 3 decades doing this, it's not just Ferrari, it's most exotic or luxury car companies that do a great job in the engineering and the design, but they failed to get the finished product. And what I mean by that is that the paint condition always has imperfections. You would think that if for a $500,000 or $1 million car, that these manufacturers would take more care to make sure that these cars are dialed in or teach the car dealerships on how to get them prepped and ready from transport. Because we know things can happen between the port and the dealership, and things can happen at the dealership. But that comes down to communication. And I guess there's a lack of, or maybe they don't think that that's required. So customers have now learned in the last probably decade that they're going to go to experts like us or people in the industry that are experts to have it cared for and protect it in the best manner and maintain the best appearance because they did invest a lot of money. So if you think about it, painting a car is expensive. And the reason it's expensive is not necessarily the process in which the car is painted, because a lot of it's robotic now, right? It's not hand painted like the Bentleys and the Rollses, which I believe they still do some of that themselves. But now when they're producing, 3,000 Huracans in a year or 3,000 458s in a year, obviously they've got to figure out how to cut cost. And back in the 80s, and I've been doing this since the early 80s, the paint was what we call solvent based. And the manufacturer at that time was Glasurit, and they were the supplier to Ferrari for all their paint. And a mixed bag of these cars would be base coat, clear coat, which is urethane, and some cars would be single stage, like the Corso Red. And so you would get pigment in the pad when you polish, and then you knew there was no clear. Now, the thing is, the mill thickness or the amount of material they would put back then would put a gauge on it to measure how much paint is on the vehicle. Could be anywhere from 8 to 12 mils, which was fantastic because if something happened to your car and you got paint imperfections, you had room to play with to have it professionally polished or sand it to repair the damage. Let's forward to today. So today's clear coats, say on a new Ferrari, when we measure it, we found could be anywhere between 5 and 6 mils, sometimes less if they spot sanded or buffed at the factory or at the car dealership, and the customer's not going to know any different. Not until you actually put a gauge on the car and you figure out, hey, there's a risk here. You got to tell the customer if you want me to get that imperfection out because somebody's already tried. When you look at the cost savings for a manufacturer like Ferrari today, I'm sure that they're saving millions of dollars a year by putting less material in a car, but that makes it more difficult for the people working on the car if there's a problem. Now remember, these robots are measuring precise amount of material per car and they're dipping in. They got this to a science. So you're not dealing with a big tolerance here. It's a very small tolerance. So when polishing surfaces like this or any kind of sanding, the attention to detail, right, is super important. And you got to approach it in a certain manner to make sure that you are not affecting the integrity or the value of the car. Let's say you were to find a rare, like let's say 328 Ferrari, and it was Corsa Red, and you found it in a barn, and we were to pull it out of the barn, and assuming then that the car still had paint because we don't know what's happened since it's in the barn, I have pulled a couple barn finds out of cars and being able to polish and color sand them to almost perfection of what it looked like from the factory. If you were to pull out a, say, Ferrari A12 in 20 years from now, you couldn't do what you could do with a Ferrari from the 80s. It would not be the same. And the reason is that you don't have a lot of solids, which is what paint is made of, or gauge or thickness that you have enough surface to actually work with and reduce, like what you could do with the Glasurit paints in the 80s, which was solvent-based, because the new paints today are water-based for environmental reasons. They call it VOC, compliant. And what that means in simple terms is that they're doing it to meet certain requirements, so it's safe for the environment, but it's not great for long term. It's not going to hold up like the older solvent-based urethanes. So when we receive, like, we'll use a Ferrari as an example, and a customer picks up the car at the shop, the first thing we do is pull it into the shop under focus lighting, and then we've handheld LED lights and paint gauges to kind of assess the paint and the condition of the paint finish. We want to do that because depending on the protection that the customer is requesting, whether it's ceramic coating or paint protection film, we need to make sure that it's imperfection free before we move forward on that. And what we find is that the factory can leave dust in the paint or orange peel in certain areas that's thicker than the rest of the car, or just kind of like dirt that we have to color sand and buff out. And this is not common on all Ferraris, but especially your darker color vehicles, you're going to find some pretty severe imperfections. And the dealers don't tend to like us because of that, but the customer's hiring us to be the expert because they paid a lot of money for this car and they're not going to just drive around a car. They obviously paid for the quality and the standard, which is what Ferrari represents today. When we're working on these cars and once we figure out a plan of action of what we're going to do with the car, and let's say hypothetically it's a black pick an F8, which you saw on our YouTube channel. We recently worked on a couple black F8s. The pattern product combination, depending on the level of imperfections, can average anywhere from 20 to 40 man hours in order to get it ready for paint protection film or ceramic coating. And that's due to the fact that there's multiple steps of cutting and finishing that we have to use a strategy we call pattern product combination. And then we have to inspect the paint in between each step to make sure with focused lighting, it's ready to go. So the new Ferraris today are base coat, clear coat. They're not single stage. We haven't seen single stage paint jobs since the 80s. And so today is a base coat, clear coat. And if you have a straight like jet black F8, they can be very temperamental because the paint's still curing from the factory, even though it maybe had been built a few months ago. And so sometimes we like to put a heat lamp, or in Vegas, it's hot out. We'll tell the customer we're going to let it sit outside in the sun and bake for a good 4 or 5 days, so that the solids and the urethane can gas off, and then we can properly polish it so we don't get that fade back or haziness in the process. You can't just go to the store and buy a product and work on a car like that and expect to get optimal results. Or you could watch one of the YouTube channels like us or another channel like Chicago Auto Pros or Ammo and learn basics. But to execute this level of polishing and correction would take a lot of hands-on education and a coach or a mentor to teach you how to really do this, so that when you get stuck in the corner, he teaches the solutions. So there's a real strategy behind this, and this is why it's kind of an art, right? Because the whole goal here is to make the car look like it was always detailed, not just detailed, whether it's a year old or 25 years old. When buying a car like this, you want to look for somebody that's an expert that understands how to meet that level of expectation of what you want the car to look like and how you want to maintain the car, right? So it's important that you spend a few $1,000s, because if you think about it, it's a small percentage of the value of the car to have insurance, knowing that you've got the best protection and that you can actually enjoy driving the car and not sweat it about how it's going to hold up or how it's going to look, or you chasing down that rabbit hole by trying to save, a couple dollars, you're jumping over pennies. And you don't want to really do that, right? You've worked hard to buy that car. So you know what? They always say you get what you pay for. And if you're looking for price and not expectation, you might not want to buy a car like this, because you're going to get disappointed, because it's not going to be what you imagine it to be. Ferrari has done an epic job building the most beautiful cars in the world, but due to demand of people in the world wanting the car, you can't always get perfection, because it's not possible when you're distributing and building this many cars compared to 30 years ago, where you're talking about a handful of cars versus now you're talking about thousands of cars. And there's going to be quality somewhere that's going to be missing when you start to scale a brand that's used to doing small batches versus big batches. And so people ask us when we look at cars, because when cars come in and we go to give a price to ceramic coat a car, right? And when we talk to them on the phone, they're like, hey, I just want a ballpark, right? And it's really hard because we tell them that the foundation is the prep before the coating. It doesn't matter if it's our coating or somebody else's coating. The prep's the most important. So that being said, the cars that we say can be polished and coat with no correction generally tend to be Toyota products or Lexus products. And the ones that we have the most problems with tend to be the Ferraris, the Lamborghinis, the Bentleys, the Rolls Royces, the McLarens. These all tend to come in with a lot of paint issues. Not a bad paint job, but a lot of finishing issues. And the normal cars that are in the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 range that are dark can come into our facility and require very little prep in order to get coated. And that's shocking because you would think the opposite, right? Because you're paying more money, you get a higher quality paint job, less prep, should be better. Well, it doesn't work like that from our experience.
We'd like to thank Glossit for supporting the VinWiki channel this month, and right now Glossit is offering the best DIY ceramic coating package that we've ever seen or certainly offered here on VinWiki. For just $69.99, you're going to get their graphene ceramic coating along with the Real Difference Maker, their ceramic detail spray. Now that's a $50 bottle of spray detailer that I truly love just for daily use, but when you use that alongside their graphene ceramic coating, it makes the removal a lot easier, the outcome a lot smoother, you avoid high spots and things like that. So a DIY idiot like me in my own garage can achieve an outcome pretty similar to what Rich and his team were able to do last year on the Paris Hilton SLR, which I eventually torture tested on rallies and road trips and all this stuff, and it is now in Bulgaria, still looking wonderful. So check it out now at the link in the description below. There's a very limited quantity, so respond now and get yours for just $69.99. Thanks, Glossit.